if somebody's taking psychedelics every weekend or every other week or microdosing every single day, does that constitute an addiction? But I think the question that I want to pose in those scenarios, because I was questioning myself as well. I was wondering whether I was just using psychedelics as another addiction, quote unquote, instead of alcohol. And the answer that I tell myself today,
I have a lot of questions for you today because we have decided to do this little interview style thing here today. So, um, you work in psychedelics. So, my first question would be, why would anybody want to use psychedelics in their life?
so psychedelics are a broad range of substances and they have a broad range of effects and reasons for use. But I would say some of the biggest reasons are for healing trauma, breaking free from patterns that are deeply rooted in our nervous systems. Another one is accessing spiritual or mystical states of consciousness, expanding your consciousness and your worldview, and potentially as well, just as a feel-good kind of supplement thing. There are different experiences that can be had with psychedelics depending on the dosages, and so this will also lead to different outcomes.
And you said that you were only going to speak to one of them today, weren't you? So, can you mention the name of that? And it's only legal in the Netherlands, isn't it?
Yeah, currently a lot of psychedelics such as LSD or DMT are, and even magic mushrooms, which contain psilocybin, are illegal in a lot of places. Now, the laws are opening up a little bit as more and more research is being done. But magic mushrooms have been legal in the Netherlands for a while, and actually nowadays it's the truffles parts that are legal, and it contains the same active compound, which is psilocybin.
Gosh. Okay, so what is the science and what is the modern hype of these substances? And yeah, let's go with that.
Well, the modern hype is a little bit to do with the revival of psychedelic research. Now, psychedelic research started in the first half of the 20th century with a lot of research happening with LSD in psychiatry in the 1950s. It was used for many things like end of life anxiety, alcoholism, depression, things like that. But because of the war on drugs in the 70s, psychedelics started getting a bad reputation and had this marketing image that they're drugs, that they fry your brain, that they all this sort of bad reputation. And now, since the early 2000s or so, the science is coming back online. Funding is happening a little bit more. People's mindsets are changing. And it's also important to note that psychedelics are not a discovery from the 20th century. We have a lot of indigenous tribes, wisdom traditions, and spiritual roots of perhaps a lot of the major religions, or at the very least, other belief systems that exist in the world have been potentially inspired, if not actively using psychedelics as a part of the culture for thousands of years. And people are now starting to connect those dots together while at the same time seeing massive benefits and potential as breakthrough medicines in the world of psychiatry or trauma healing. And so I think for all these reasons, the laws are changing and the hype is building up. but we have to be cautious as well in how we approach this research and respect also that they exist as a part of nature, and these compounds are here just like any other compound on Earth, and we can just get to know them better.
Wow. So, and I suppose that because they are you and the thing that you're talking about is a natural compound. That's really interesting, as opposed to like acid and stuff like that. Okay, so my next question is, what is the legal status of these compounds?
So it's interesting you mentioned acid as a not natural compound, and that's true to some extent, though there are very, very similar molecules that do exist in the nature. For example, acid is a molecule called LSD, but there's another molecule which is also psychedelic that is called LSA and does exist in some seeds in nature. And there's all sorts of boundaries that can be dissolved when we think between legal status versus what is a molecule. Um, in general, most psychedelics are illegal in a lot of places. There are some hotspots that exist. For example, in Costa Rica, I believe, in some parts of South America, where ayahuasca has been utilized for many, many years by indigenous populations. Um, in Portugal, they're not legal, but they are decriminalized because they've had such a big problem with substances. It turned out that decriminalizing the substances has reduced their substance problem impact. And again, in the Netherlands, where psilocybin truffles are legal, there are businesses out there that are making psychedelic retreats in a fully open and fully legal way. And meanwhile, there are some places in the world where potentially traditional medicines, like maybe in Mexico with cacti, such as San Pedro, which is a mescaline-based psychedelic, might not have full legal status, but might have a little bit more compassion by the eyes of the law as a traditional medicine, in the same way as a grandmother's magical herb recipe. So, yeah, and as we say this, more and more research is being done on various substances in various places around the world. There's a lot more, and while it's illegal for personal use, possession, and all this sort of thing, there are a lot more clinical trials that are happening in very academic or government controlled settings where the use of high quality, pure psychedelics are legal. And for those, they have very specific entry requirement criteria because of the re nature of the research setting or the clinical trial. But this is also something that's going on a lot, notably in the US, notably in Canada, in Switzerland, and also the UK.
Wow. So I have one question that I hadn't prepared. What drew you to this type of work? I'm curious.
For me personally, my story involves a lot of psychedelic use, and at first I was basically self-medicating recreationally, but I also noticed that I was using alcohol in a similar way. I would get drunk so that I could get in a certain state, so that I can have certain experiences, whether it was more confidence, whether it was more dancing, more social, less friction. I was using the substance to facilitate a state that led to an experience. But I was doing research on alcohol, and I was also experiencing the hangovers the next day, and that was an experience that I didn't want. And in my substance research, I learned a bit about psychedelics, and I saw that psychedelics are actually way less harmful for the body than alcohol. And so I thought, interesting. How is alcohol legal and these drugs are illegal? And eventually I got to trying one and I realized, wow, not only is it less harmful for the body, but also it's cheaper and it feels much better. So for me, it was a triple win that psychedelics had over alcohol, and I ended up using it quite frequently instead of alcohol. That was the early days, and then eventually I discovered more about the world of trauma and spirituality that can be bridged through the experiences with these substances, and that fascinated me even more, particularly because in between those 2 points, I also had a mental health issue, and that's figuring out the roots of this mental health issue while at the same time healing from the roots with psychedelics has also been a part of this journey. So it's a subject that I care deeply about and that I'm fascinated to dive deeper into the research.
Gosh, I think it's important to know why you, as a person, are interested in it rather than just these are the advantages, these are the disadvantages, because when there's a personal story, it becomes far more interesting. So thank you for sharing that. That's much appreciated. Okay, ha! You're going to like this. Are they addictive, these substances?
It's an interesting question because the default answer is no. They're actually anti-addictive, and in the sense that if you take a psychedelic today and you take one tomorrow at the same dosage, the effect of tomorrow's psychedelic is going to be a lot less because you build sensitivity immediately, and it doesn't do the job. There's more on addiction research behind psychedelics, but they're very powerful experiences, and it's a fine line as well to say that if somebody's taking psychedelics every weekend or every other week or microdosing every single day, does that constitute an addiction? But I think the question that I want to pose in those scenarios, because I was questioning myself as well. I was wondering whether I was just using psychedelics as another addiction, quote unquote, instead of alcohol. And the answer that I tell myself today is that I've actually detached from the need for psychedelics thanks to psychedelics. It's an ironic thing, but that is not something that an addictive substance would be able to do. An addictive substance just makes you want more and more, or find it more difficult to quit, whereas I think psychedelics can help us do the opposites.
That was certainly not the answer I was expecting.
It's not a common thing to know unless one is already watching psychedelic content or looking at some psychedelic research.
I suppose that there's also a difference between psychedelics and drugs, isn't there? Because I mean, the because when I grew up, we heard stories of people that were like injecting stuff into themselves, and I guess that that's a completely different thing to the psychedelic. I have no idea. I don't understand the difference. So, I would have thought that yes, they would be addictive. So when you said that they're not addictive, I'm like, Gosh, wow. So not the answer I was expecting. I have another question though. Do you want to say something before I?
Yeah, I definitely want to speak on the subject of drug versus psychedelic, and even well, psychedelics dissolve boundaries. Like for me right now, there's no material boundary between me and the camera that I'm speaking to. For me, it is all part of one universe. The fact that my mind has to create this idea of separation, that I am this human body and I'm not my camera, is a mental concept, and psychedelics help us break those mental concepts down. And I want to expand that into the mental concept of what is a drug versus what is a medicine versus what is food. You know, if we are stopping our breathing and stop taking oxygen, then our body has a need for it. And we want to have that. At the same time, if we stop taking food, eventually our body makes a rebellion and gives us signals that we need food. When we're sick, we need rest and potentially medicines. But the difference between, you know, what's a human-made medicine versus what is a nature-made medicine is a mental concept. And it's the same argument that I say between drug versus not drug. For me, the legal status of a substance doesn't make it a drug or a medicine. There are some medicines that are illegal, just like there are some drugs like alcohol that are legal. And you know, by talking about things in this way, we start to make cognitive dissonance mental models in the minds of people to realize, oh yeah, like tobacco's a drug, coffee is a drug, the most widely consumed and accepted one in the world, Western world.
What about
But
chocolate? Is that considered a drug
that,
or is
you
that
know,
just
that's
addictive food?
that's again blurring those blinds and dissolving those boundaries because you know when you go into the shamanic indigenous traditions that have cacao in their environment, they use cacao as a medicine and they make ceremonies. Having been to a few cacao ceremonies, those things really blur the boundaries between is chocolate a food, a medicine, or a drug? Why not all three? You know, it's just a question of one, perspective, two, dosage, and three, also intention. Because if you take your chocolates by eating the full bar of chocolates at 10 p.m. because some emotional problem, that's an addiction. But if you take one square or one row of chocolate in a mindful way and make it in a ceremony, all of a sudden it's no longer an addiction. The substance is the same, but what changed is the context and the intention. And this is another important part of psychedelic work as well.
And we could dive even deeper because then there's sugar, which is highly addictive, right? And it's legal.
The
And
worst drug in the world, sugar.
it's so interesting and it's actually legal. And you think, wow, sugar is highly addictive and it's legal. And how does that even work? I mean, we're not going to jump into that particular rabbit hole
That's a
right now
whole
because
other rabbit hole, yeah.
I know, I know, I know. And I mean, it feels like a really fantastic conversation, by the way. You are definitely enlightening me a lot. So, okay, I have obviously more questions. What's psychedelic work like? How do you prepare? What's the journey like? And most importantly, what do you do after?
That's a big topic. But to give a high level overview of, you know, what is a psychedelic program, for example, if one were to either work with me or go for a retreat in the Netherlands or go to Costa Rica for a retreat, there would be a container. that is created between the moment of making the exchange and commitment to doing this work. And from that moment until the retreat actually happens is the phase of preparation. This is the phase where once someone has been screened, as this happens before the commitment to the work, there are some safety and ethical considerations when it comes to screening. So that is a step zero. But once you go from step zero to step one is the preparation work that leads up to step two, which would be a retreat in a legal setting. That retreat would usually happen over the space of at least 3 days. And in those 3 days, there would be one preparation day, one medicine dosage day where the experience of the psychedelic journey happens, and one integration day, landing day from the actual experience. Now, what the actual experience might look like is going to vary a lot based on the individual, based on the amount and type of preparation, based on the dosage that has been agreed is the right dosage for A, their comfort level, and B, their intention of the type of work. And what I mean by this is if somebody has a lot of psychedelic experience, they can maybe be confident in having a higher dosage right away. But if somebody's never had any psychedelic experiences, it might be a better idea to start off on a smaller or medium dose and then build it up in the future. Now there's arguments to both sides, but this is a part of what the psychedelic work preparation is for.
Can I inject something here?
Yeah.
What is the lowest dosage that is usable in those situations? Because I mean, I'm really hesitant towards any of this. Uh, so I'm just curious, what's the tiniest dosage that would be recommended for someone as hesitant as me? I really
Yeah, fair, fair. I like to make the parallel with alcohol because, you know, if you take a glass of wine, you might feel a certain effect, or maybe you need 2 glasses to have that effect. But you don't need to consume those 2 glasses in one shot. If you take one sip of one glass, you're not going to get much effect, you know? And so you can pretty much make that same range equivalent with psychedelics. There's a certain number dosage below which you don't feel anything at all. It is sub-perceptual. Then there's a range which is just barely perceptible and then becomes increasingly perceptible. And that's a range before any hallucinations happen. That's a range where you just feel good, things feel different, but the world is still as it is. And then the bigger you go into the dosages, the more you get into the psychedelic hallucination, ego death kind of experiences. But to give you a rough idea of numbers, in terms of psilocybin truffles in the Netherlands, you're probably looking at 5 to 10 grams to start barely feeling something. Now, a more medium dose would be in the 10 to 20, 20 to 30 maybe. And from 30 grams would be a higher dose range. And they have different therapeutic philosophies as well, which is another layer to the psychedelic work thing. When you are taking a high dose psychedelic, you are basically letting the psychedelic experience be the medicine, and you're intentionally going into a more altered state. Whereas if you are on the lower end of the spectrum, in terms of dosage is you are you're putting yourself in a state where your defenses will soften a little bit. You can access your emotions a little bit more, but you can still have a talk therapy session with someone. So, for example, in the future, even currently today, there are people who are trained as XYZ therapists in whatever XYZ modality. And if they want to use psychedelics to enhance their practice, they can use the smaller dosage range prior to the session, and the client will then be able to open up more. But they won't have these big hallucinations or ego death experiences. And that's more or less the difference between psycholytic, which is lower dose range, versus psychedelic, which is higher dose range therapy. Though when people speak about psychedelic therapy in general, they kind of talk about both. I guess that's a bit more of a technical term differentiation.
Okay, wow. I feel mind blown already.
There's a lot. There's a lot to
S-
it.
Yeah. So, I think you've touched a little bit on what you get as an outcome, and you've also talked a little bit of how life changes. So, who is it for, who's it not for, and what might a professional who's never done drugs get from it?
That's a great question. I first refer back to the screening criteria. Any psychedelic therapist that is worth their reputation and ethical considerations will not be accepting anyone who is showing too many red flags, whether they are biological red flags, like too much history of mental illness, psychosis, schizophrenia type of things, or cardiac problems as well are a big one, and taking certain medication combinations. There are some red flags and there are some yellow flags. So it's important to say that every situation is unique and every institution or person will have their own unique screening process, but the ideal is a collaborative effort in order to figure out whether a psychedelic work for your own safety is acceptable or not for you. Beyond that, I think it's really for anyone who wants to expand their consciousness to connect with something that is either greater than themselves or outside of themselves, or perhaps their own true self, depending on the belief view that we attribute to these kinds of concepts. That's one aspect, and another one is the people who are, yeah, really interested in going to the deepest layers of their trauma or of the roots of their psychological, spiritual, and emotional issues and blockages. And again, many ways to frame this. But if we talk from a spiritual perspective, we can say somebody who's blocked in XYZ chakra that has been stuck in that state for years and tried many modalities that haven't worked. Maybe psychedelics could be what unblocks it. Or particularly deep wounds from childhood, or just the big kind of hairy traumas that are hard to kind of work through. This could be a really good use case.
Wow. I have definitely gotten a lot of information here today, and I just want to say thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask you these questions because I have felt extremely hesitant. I still probably don't feel 100% convinced yet. Um, so it might not be for me, who knows? It was just really interesting to learn about the power and purpose of psychedelics and the intention. So thank you so much for your time today, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, see you soon.